Thank you for joining me for Storytime with Tanya for this holiday series story called Strings of Gold, and is inspired by a violinist that I watch on TikTok who seems to be bringing joy to the world through music, and that's where the idea from the story came from. So, without further ado, Strings of Gold, Part 1. The Greyhound bus hissed and groaned as it eased to a halt beneath the flickering yellow glow of the Clarksdale platform lights. Its worn chassis shuddered like an old man's knees under the strain as rust-speckled wheel wells exhaled thick white steam. When the air brakes howled an anguished metallic scream, it reverberated across the empty yard like a wounded beast crying out for mercy. Inside, the stale, clinging warmth of hours on the road lingered in the cracked vinyl seats, scented with diesel oil and the faint tang of body odor. One by one, passengers uncurled stiff limbs, their elbows popping, and fumbled for threadbare coats pulled thin at the seams. They produced crumpled paper bags scented with leftover sandwiches, faces brightening at the promise of crisp night air. Among them stood Elijah Cole, tall, lean, his skin a dark gleaming brown of polished mahogany, warmed by candlelight. His shoulders squared, spine rigid, yet the muscles along his neck and forearms quivered as if each breath carried a personal burden. In his right hand, he held his only treasure, a battered violin case whose once sleek curves were nicked by years of travel. The cracked leather wrapping its handle revealed pale underpinnings, and the brass clasps were mottled with a soft, brassy green patina. Clarksdale had gone quiet, the silence fragile as new snow. Christmas approached, and storefronts darkened early each evening. Through dusty windows, colored bulbs formed halos that pulsed slow and solemn against the night. The hardware store's pine and holly wreath hung limp, its red berries faded by winter's breath. Beneath the only street lamp, itself adorned with sprigs of holly, timber planks groaned underfoot while the lights flickered and cast pale oval pools across the frost-kissed square. A woman, wrapped in a heavy wool coat, patched at the elbows, hurried past, her small son tugging anxiously at her sleeve. His wool cap slipped over one ear, and his breath escaped in tiny cloudbursts. The boy dawdled in his tiny boots, crunching fragile ice. She scolded him in a low voice as they passed the darkened windows of the barber shop, where inside a stout man in suspenders leaned in the doorway, smoking a pipe. Lazy rings curled around his neatly trimmed mustache as the smoke drifted. Elijah set his case gently on the rough-hewn bench beneath the sputtering street lamp. His gloved fingers, calloused and sure, worked the oxidized clasp open with a soft click. The lamp's amber glow caught the bow's gleaming horsehair as the lid lifted. The violin's burnished wood grain, now rich and velvety from years of loving care, glowed. A deep purple velvet lining cradled the instrument like a close-fisted hug. He lifted the violin, tucking its polished body gently against his chin. The polished maple nestled against his skin like a living extension. His bow hovered for a beat, then drifted across the strings in a tentative, trembling caress. A low hum bloomed into the night, vibrating through the still air like distant thunder. Steadying himself, he pressed harder and sprang a clear, weeping note that rippled outward like gentle waves across a frozen pond. The opening strains trembled with sorrow, a mournful cry born from the earth itself. Then, as if chasing away tears, he laced in a sudden playful flourish, a bright skipping melody that twirled between grief and joy. He wove in fragments of the old hymns his grandmother once hummed in a sweltering Alabama kitchen, half-remembered words drifting above each bow-stroked phrase, each note stretched and bent, glowing in the cold like a suspended droplet of light before dissolving into the next. The little boy tugged his mother's skirt again. "Mama, listen," he whispered, eyes wide and shining. She paused, hand over her heart, and let the music wash through her like warm water. Across the square, the barber straightened, releasing a slow plume of smoke. The men lingering by the corner stilled their chatter until it hushed into reverent silence. Elijah's melody held them fast, soft, but insistent, like a gentle guide through the darkness. With eyes closed, Elijah felt his father's voice drift back to him with a quote he'd held dear through dark days. "A violin is a fiddle in one hand and a prayer in the other." He recalled muddy World War I trenches where he'd played for hollow-eyed soldiers, their ragged sobs rising with familiar hymns summoning memories of home. He smelled kerosene lanterns on creaking back porches, heard laughter and sorrow tangled in the same breath as dancing feet stamped out hopeful rhythms. When his bow finally stilled, the square hung in profound stillness. Snowflakes drifted downward without a sound. No one moved, as though the music itself had woven a spell across the cold night. The boy pressed a mittened hand to his mother's arm. "Mama, that sounded like Christmas." Her voice trembled as she answered, "Baby, that sounds like hope." Elijah offered them a gentle, rueful smile, snapped the violin case shut, and lifted it from the bench with effortless grace. Without raising a hand for coins or uttering farewell, he turned and walked away into the silent streets. His music was the gift itself. By morning, Clarksdale would be abuzz with stories. Some would call him a wanderer with a tired fiddle slung over his shoulder. Others would swear the music was a blessing, stitching strangers together beneath the winter stars. And so, with his case at his back and his heavy heart with song, Elijah Cole continued his southward road, his golden strings leaving echoes of joy wherever walls once stood. The highway stretched before Elijah like a silken ribbon, unfurling through a winter tapestry. Towering pines arched overhead, their needles dusted in a crystalline frost that caught the pale sunlight and shattered it into 1,000 icy sparks. The air was sharp enough to bite his cheeks as it carried the tang of evergreen wood smoke drifting from hidden cabins. His violin rested at his side in its case, its warm amber varnish glowing against the cold as if the instrument itself harbored a hearth inside. His possessions were few, but his purpose was vast. He sought not the thunder of clapping hands, but the silent quiver of awakened souls. In Columbia, he stopped at a weathered porch where a widow sat, her shawl wrapped tight against the wind. He imagined the hush in her chest when his bow coaxed out a gentle melody, and as he continued, a single droplet of grief caught the light as it fell, darkening the weathered pine beneath her rocking chair. In the outskirts of Florence, he found farmhands crouched over frost-crusted soil, their breath curling into pale ghosts in the morning air. His reels urged their weary muscles awake, the melodies driving burrows through frozen tears and laughter through frozen lungs. In Charleston's narrow streets, children chased each other beneath gas lamps, their laughter as bright as fireflies. There he spun old jigs before them, so alive that he felt he could taste their joy, sweet as molasses and warm as sunlight on cold cheeks. It was in Charleston that his bow found its truest voice. The city lay hushed under swags of lanterns draped over wrought iron balconies. Each flame quivered against draping Spanish moss that swayed like silent metronomes in the salt-tinged breeze. Wreaths of holly and bay leaves, glossy and fragrant, graced every door, their deep greens and reds glowing against white clapboard walls. But beneath the festive shimmer, a brittle tension trembled in the cold. Neighbors walked with careful distance. Black and white worshippers sang identical carols beneath separate doors, where beneath their feet ran fault lines no eye could see, but every heart could feel. Elijah approached a tall whitewashed church, whose slender steeple seemed to pierce the slate sky. Candlelight flickered beneath the stained glass, casting jeweled pools of crimson and emerald light into the bricks below. Evergreen wreaths hung from the church's massive mahogany doors. Their red ribbons stirred gently in the night air. Inside, crimson and evergreen robes rustled like gift wrap as the choir members filled into formation, their polished shoes marking quiet rhythm against the worn wooden floors. The air smelled faintly of incense, old hymnals, warmed beeswax, and polished pews. When the choir's hymn rose, clear, tremulous, the same melody on every tongue, their voices filled the rafters, yet quivered with unspoken walls between pews. Elijah lingered at the back, his violin case cradled like a promise. A deacon in a stiff white collar regarded him with careful suspicion. "Do you play?" he demanded, as he clutched a leather-bound hymnal to his chest. Elijah nodded, voice low and steady. "I do." The deacon studied him a heartbeat longer, then inclined his head. "You're welcome to play here this evening." When the final choir note dissolved into the hush, Elijah lifted his beloved violin. The varnished wood gleamed under candlelight as his bow kissed the strings. What emerged was a tone both rough and radiant. No polished concert hall precision, but the living pulse of earth and memory. He began with an old hymn, its familiar melody stretching and sighing as he wove African melodies through its veins. The note then spiraled into Appalachian reels that echoed mountain hollows and kinship. Each phrase conjured a different heartbeat, a low thrum like distant drums, a quicksilver dance like bluegrass fiddles at dawn, a solemn hush like midnight prayers in candlelit chapels. At first, the congregation stiffened. Folded hands shivered. A murmur rippled through the benches. Then, a black seamstress in the front row, her fingers still stained with thread and ink, lifted her head. As Elijah's bow sang, she caught the melody and began to hum, her voice trembling like a candle flame until it steadied and filled the aisle. Opposite her, an elderly white man, hair silver beneath the flickering candles, cleared his throat. Uncertainty softened into resolve. He joined her in a hesitant note. By the second verse, their voices had woven into one ribbon of sound. Others picked up the thread. Low contraltos, bright tenors, the soft rustle of skirts against wooden floors, until the church seemed to pulse with taps and hand claps. The walls that had held them apart trembled under the force of unity and music. Elijah's bow danced like fire on the strings, entwining sorrow and hope with every single stroke. Golden filaments of song seemed to stretch from the violin to each listening heart, stitching open wounds with a melody. He closed his eyes and felt those strands binding soul to soul, weaving broken edges into something whole. At last, when he drew out one single aching note, it hung in the rafters like new fallen snow. It seemed as if in that moment the world paused, breathless and full of promise. The seamstress and the old man remained side by side, their faces luminous in the candlelight, speaking a truth that no one word could capture, for this night the old divides had melted away. Elijah lowered his violin, offered a gentle nod, and slipped out into the chill air before the first clap could rise. Outside, the harbor wind carried the sharp bite of salt and the resinous scent of pine, while distant bells tolled midnight over dark waters. With his violin case tucked beneath his arm, he walked on into the night, the echoes of unity trailing behind him like a benediction. By the time Elijah stepped onto the cobblestones of Savannah, Christmas morning had unfolded in a wash of pale, crystal-like light. Every breath he drew felt like tiny glass needles in his lungs. A low winter sun, fragile and wavering, struck the Spanish moss-draping ancient live oaks, turning every silvery thread into glimmers of holiday tinsel. Iron balconies bore swinging lanterns, whose golden glow shone across shuttered windows, illuminating bundled families leaning out with their scarves wound tight against biting air, their faces bright with anticipation for the day's unwrapped treasures and lingering holiday magic. All around him, the city pulsed with festivity. Church bells pealed in jubilant cascades that skipped across rooftops. Choirs sent curling ribbons of carols through the frosty air, and street vendors, faces rosy from the cold, hooded themselves beside streaming urns of spiced cider and piles of chestnuts whose hot, earthy scent curled out into the square. Their calls rose and fell in musical chatter, mingling with the laughter of passerbys. At the heart of the square, massive wooden tables bowed beneath the morning's bounty, pastelitos light as snowflakes, their sugar-dusted crust splitting to reveal molten guava jam, bowls of gullah rice, each pearl of grain flecked with smoky ham and sprigs of green onion. Braided German loaves, golden crust crackled at every glance, and pecan pies so glossy with caramelized syrup they mirrored the winter sky. Garlands of fragrant evergreen and clusters of scarlet holly berries crowned every stall, filling the air with pine wood sweetness. Children in woolen coats, buttons gleaming and mismatched mittens, skipped between tents, their laughter tinkling like wind chimes. Soldiers home on leave, uniforms still flecked with dust, clasped wives and siblings in breath-clouded embraces while strangers haggled good-naturedly over mugs of cider. Yet, beneath the jubilance, Elijah sensed an undercurrent as taut as tightening bowstring. Invisible lines segmented the crowd. A Mexican baker, palms dusted white with flour, gently offered conchas only to Spanish speakers. A pale-fingered farmer, his breath muffled by a wool scarf, passed slices of pie solely to the neighbors of his own hue. From one corner drifted the sharp lilt of a fiddle, and from the other, the steady pulse of African drums, two melodies coexisting without touching. Elijah lingered at the fringe, cold as his battered violin case pressed into his thigh. He remembered every mile he'd traveled and considered how music could pry open the most hardest of hearts. And yet, how it could also lay bare the walls people built around themselves. As he unlatched the brass clasps, each click rang out like an invitation. As he lifted the violin from its snug cradle, the winter sun caught its varnished curves, setting them aglow in warm amber hues. He drew the bow, horsehair taut and shining with promise, and gently eased it on the strings. The first note unfurled like a ribbon of amber, soft as a hearth cinder, kindling warmth beneath his ribs. It drifted across frost-kissed stones until the clamor stilled and all eyes turned toward him. Children with breathless gazes, parents halted mid-step, onlookers perched on the divide of curiosity. Slowly, Elijah coaxed the familiar strains of Silent Night into the air, each phrase softened by his yearning. Then he bent its lines upward with slender threads of blue-toned harmonies that seemed to sweep with longing. Without pause, he shifted into the shortened beat of gullah rhythms, percussive bow taps and staccato footwork that sent ripples through shivering feet before spiraling into the lilting swirl of Irish reels, melodies that leapt and danced like flickering candlelight. This tapestry of sound belonged to no one people. It belonged to all of them, stitched together on a single soaring breath. A polished booted soldier tapped out a gentle pulse, his rigid stance softening as he caught sight of a bronze jeweler swaying beside him in her vibrant floral dress and copper bangles that clinked like distant bells. He offered a hesitant smile. She returned it with equal warmth, and soon their hands found an unspoken rhythm. The Mexican baker balanced a tray of steaming pastelitos, approached a farmer's wife in a hooded cloak, and pressed a warm pastry into her mittened grasp. "Feliz Navidad," he murmured. She laughed, surprise blooming on her cheeks, and replied in kind, "Merry Christmas," as they shared the sweet guava filling between them. Children drifted forward, gathering in a widening ring around Elijah. Their voices, crystalline and fearless, rose to join his melody. In English, in Spanish, and in the soft Gullah dialect their grandparents had carried across the ocean. Elijah's bow flew in graceful arcs, weaving every child's voice into a golden chorus. Some swore they saw fine filaments of light spinning from the violin, wrapping around shoulders and hearts until the whole square shimmered as one. Whether real or conjured by longing, the glow hardly mattered. On that morning, walls between people dissolved like sugar in hot tea. When he drew the final note, the square erupted into ovation like a tide of cheers that rocked lanterns overhead. The applause sang like thunder. People laughed and clasped each other's backs. Plates of food exchanged hands across lines that had once seemed unbridgeable. Children dashed into welcoming arms, their eyes wide as if encountering a world remade. But Elijah did not linger for accolades. He slipped the violin gently back into its case, clicked the latches shut, and, with soft-footed grace, melted into the dispersing crowd. By the riverbank, where icy currents whispered against time-worn stones, he paused. In the glassy water, the echoes of laughter and song lingered like scattered bells. His hands hovered over the case, glowing faintly in the pale dawn, as if they had strummed threads of purest gold. A contented smile curved his lips. Then he turned southward, retracing the river's edge, disappearing into the chill. His music, a promise unspoken, drifted behind him on the crisp morning air. And for everyone who listened, that Christmas became far more than feasting and gifts. It became the courage to unlatch old doors, to hear another's melody, and to let something new and beautiful be born in the space between. The end. As I expressed when I first started this series, this story is inspired by a violinist that I saw one day on TikTok. And this Christmas story is inspired by the way that music can be a unifier if you let it. So music is a way to bridge the gap in a divide, in a time where it feels like we really need it. And I hope this story helps to inspire you in this holiday season, whether you celebrate Christmas or not. Let this story inspire you to bridge the gaps that we see almost every single day. Don't be afraid to extend a smile or hello to the stranger in front of you, no matter who they are, no matter where they come from. Kindness goes a long way. Regardless of your faith and your belief, kindness is a unifier, just like music, and just like this violinist that I saw on TikTok. So many different people from likely all over the world, from all over, he's from Charlotte, tune in to his melodies. And it's just beautiful. It's beautiful to see. And he inspired me to write this story because I think we're in a time where we really need more togetherness. And for people to just have a heart for, even if you don't agree, you can still treat people with respect and kindness, and that can go a long way. Regardless of your beliefs, you can still be kind. Now, I'm going to get off my soapbox right now. But from my family to yours, Merry Christmas. I hope that your Christmas is filled with love, joy, of course, great food. But let this story also inspire you to be kind and extend a hand in kindness to those that you see in your day-to-day life. Merry Christmas.